Hello everyone, and today we are going to be talking about the Monroe Doctrine and the shift of America's isolationism policy to imperialism, and just a lot of different things that are all going to tie together in the end, I promise. So the first thing I want to mention are just a few terms that I'm going to be mentioning throughout the whole lecture. I'll remind you as they come up, but I want to remind you also now what they mean. So the first one in both these terms are, again, according to your American Voices textbook, the main reference source. So basically what isolationism is a policy of avoiding involvement in foreign affairs. So we're not getting involved in anything going on over in Europe or anywhere else. We're kind of keeping to ourselves. And then imperialism is the policy of extending the rule of one country over other countries or colonies. As the lecture goes on, you'll see a little bit more specific details about exactly what that is. So let's time travel all the way back to when George Washington, the first president of the United States, was giving his farewell address in 1796. Now, one of his main points is that he wanted the United States to remain neutral in all foreign affairs. The United States pretty much kept this idea of isolationism that George Washington wanted the United States to keep all the way until about 1823. Now, 1823 comes along, and this president named James Monroe comes up with this idea of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, James Monroe was given his State of the Union address, and you guys should all know what that is because President Obama just gave his State of the Union address. And that was a really long speech that took up a lot of time and interrupted your favorite nighttime television shows. Yeah, that was the State of the Union address. But now think of it back in 1823 when there wasn't TV or radio or anything like that. So back in 1823, James Monroe was given his State of the Union address, and this is where this idea of the Monroe Doctrine comes on. Now again, according to American Voices textbook, James Monroe states that he wanted all European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, which is pretty much this page, United States, North America, and South America, all along here. He wanted Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere and not come over here to colonize, or they'd have to ultimately deal with the United States. In turn, for the European powers not coming over here and colonize, the United States said that they would stay out of all of the European affairs. Now, this is a pretty big deal, like Billy Costello huge kind of deal, because this is where we first start to see the shift of imperialism, or of isolationism to imperialism. So because James Monroe stated that the United States is going to, kind of beat up anyone that came over to the Americas, North or South America, with this policy of the Monroe Doctrine, that's kind of going against the policy of isolationism. So for a refresher, from American Voices, isolationism is the policy of avoiding foreign affairs. The Monroe Doctrine pretty much goes against everything that isolationism stands for. Now we're getting involved in affairs in all of the Americas, for example, South, Central, North, anywhere that Europe wanted to come over and colonize, we were going to get involved. So after the Monroe Doctrine, we now see the shift from isolationism to imperialism. Now, imperialism was an idea that America has never really dealt with before. So, imperialism, again, according to your handy-dandy American Voices textbook, is a policy of extending the rule of one country over countries or colonies. So, for example, let's say that, Great Britain wanted to come over and take a little bit of, let's just say, Cuba. Well, if they did want to come over and do that, then they would ultimately face the United States. A real-life main example of this is the Spanish-American War, which we're going to be talking about in a little bit. So usually countries wanted to come over and colonize for many reasons. Some reasons are to control raw materials so they can have them to send them back to the motherland. They can ultimately trade with all these new markets that are going to be, they're going to be colonized, and military bases. So big bully countries, big bullies, would come over to the Americas and ultimately take them over because they're smaller and weaker. The United States wanted to keep all the European powers out of the Western Hemisphere because they wanted ultimately to trade with these countries. They wanted to trade with the different Americas, and ultimately they wanted to keep the peace within the Western Hemisphere. One other example of imperialism is that in 1867 we purchased Alaska, you know, that country, or that state all the way up there. We purchased it for $7.2 million. Now, back in 1867, Alaska wasn't really discovered. We didn't really have that many people out there kind of seeing what was going on up there. And everyone at this time was like, why would we purchase a big block of ice? Ultimately, in 1867, it was called Seward's Folly, after William Seward, who was the one who ultimately purchased it. But as we know today, it was a pretty good investment. We get a lot of our oil from Alaska, so it was a pretty good deal. Oftentimes, when people hear the word of imperialism, they think of Africa. Now, why would you think of Africa and imperialism? Well, in the 1870s, there was a huge rush to go and conquer all the pieces of Africa for their raw materials and their markets that, you know, you can trade with. Now, this becomes a huge problem because it was tallied in 1885 that 14 different countries had some kind of colonies within Africa. The U.S. being one of them, and the big countries such as Germany and Great Britain, they also were in Africa at this time. Now, can you imagine this continent of Africa being split up by 14 different countries? You're going to run into some tensions. Kind of to solve these tensions, the U.S. wanted to have this open door policy, which would allow all the countries to trade in Western Africa on equal terms. So now that we have this idea of imperialism, it ultimately leads to the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War happened because Spain was in Cuba. We wanted to protect Cuba and let Cuba have their independence. So we issued an ultimatum to Spain telling them, get out of there peacefully or we're going to come in and kick your butt. Basically what happened is they didn't end up leaving, and we did kick their butt, and that's when we kind of rose to a world power. But we're going to be talking a little bit more about the Spanish-American War in a little bit more detail, more than the U.S. kicked Spain's butt, in the next lecture. So I'll see you then.